welcome on one of the last LMS Center talks of this winter semester 24. Before we start, I would like to remind that this talk is recorded, so please use the microphones in front of you when you are asking some questions during the discussion. Our today's guest is Dr. Kristine, who is currently a visiting professor at our Department of Philosophy and Social Sciences, and who will give us the talk with one of the most aesthetically interesting headlines of our program, because her lecture is called Sun, Sea and Cats, a Transspecies Ethnography of a colony of cats living on the Costa del Sol. So, Dr. Hill, welcome on LMS. We are happy that you join us, and now I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got really good at giving online seminars and lectures, so I might get thrown. I find I get thrown now when I look and I see real people. So I have a script. I may have to just stay to the script in places if to keep things on track. But yeah, thank you for the introduction and the invite, and I get to talk about my favorite topic, cats. Yeah, so this is just an outline of what I wanted to share with you today. So I'll start off with a little bit about why I call myself an amphizoologist and my interpretation of amphizoology. I'll explain my focus on cats, what drew me in the first place to want to study these fascinating creatures, and why I find cat-human relations both fascinating but also worthy of serious academic study. And then I'll share some of the key findings from my doctoral research on cat-human relations and discourses surrounding roaming cats, so that's cats that go outside, both owned and unowned, which will then lead into the main part of today's lecture, which is a multispecies or transspecies ethnographic study of a colony of cats that inhabit a tourist destination on the Costa del Sol, and that I'll be writing up during my stay here. And yeah, so this image at the bottom is one of the feeding groups from the Torremolinos colony, gathering around their official caretakers at feeding time. And a crowd of, just out of the frame, a crowd of tourists that typically gather to watch, take photos, ask questions. And the study of these interspecies interactions and the relationships is arguably the essence of amphizoology. So what is amphizoology? So it's a term, amphizoology is a term that is often used interchangeably with human-animal studies. And it's easy to get dragged down the rabbit hole of semantics, and if they are indeed different or the same. And I want to avoid that today. So I prefer the term amphizoology, but I may interchange it with human-animal studies. And different groups of academics basically favor one term over the other. But essentially, their definitions of the field tend to repeat and overlap. And in a nutshell, amphizoology or human-animal studies is the interdisciplinary study of the interactions between humans and other animals. So that the lives of humans and other animals have been intertwined since the beginning of humanity, and cultures throughout time and space have possessed considerable knowledge and understanding of these more than human beings that coexisted with them and lived alongside them, much of which is almost certainly lost. However, the systematic study of the ways in which humans relate to and think about members of other species, and even vice versa, is relatively new to Western scholars. And then previous generations of anthropologists and sociologists, they did not entirely ignore the animal others, but these beings, these animals, were more often viewed as cultural objects or side notes, or the relationships studied as a means to understand the human. And this was until what has been dubbed the animal turn, which occurred around the turn of the new millennium. And the animal term refers to this recognition by scholars in the humanities and social sciences that their research can, and in many cases should, encompass or even emphasize these relationships with the more than human world, and specifically the more than human animals. And I put a couple of key references from Tim Ingold and Harriet Ritvo and Donna Haraway at the bottom of the slide, and I think that's on the next slide actually. So there we go. Yeah, so scholars from anthropology and sociological backgrounds tended to consider anthrozoology to be a subdiscipline rather than a field in its own right. However, I'm not sure how true that is, especially today. Anyway, the Society and Animals Institute was established over 40 years ago as an interdisciplinary global research institute, and their mission was to advance and share knowledge to improve non-human animal lives. And they favor the term human-animal studies. And likewise, the Australasian Animal Studies Association established 2025. So both of these organizations in the thinking or the ethos lean more towards critical animal studies. So critical animal studies is this academic field of study dedicated to the abolition of animal exploitation, oppression, and domination. So like human animal studies more generally, critical animal studies is a field of inquiry that seeks to explore the plethora of ways that humans interact with and form relationships with animals. However, anthrozoology as a whole does not take this abolitionist stance. And anthrozoology includes a wide range of relations with other animals, including welfare in animal agriculture or zoos, but specifically including those we bring into our homes, namely pets or companion animals. So that brings us on to this second thread that fed into the emergence of anthrozoology as a distinct area of study, was the recognition within psychology and social work and related fields of the importance of companion animals in relation to the family and for their therapeutic potential. And just as a side note for now, I use companion animal in my academic writing, and I tend to favor the term over pet generally. However, I'm not opposed to the term pet, and I often switch between pet in my outreach activities. And I'll return to how we talk about other than human animals in a couple of slides, because it is important. But anyway, my point here is in the reports in the 1970s regarding the health and psychological benefits of interacting with companion animals ultimately led to the birth of anthrozoology as we know it. And this is something that Aubrey Fine, and I think I have one of his references there, referred to as a slow birth or a long labor. So the field was fertilized by support from the US National Institute of Health in the 1980s. Anthrozoos is the first dedicated journal to this field, and it was established following the success of the 1986 International Human-Animal Bond Conference in Boston in the US. And apparently there was some debate about the etymological appropriateness of combining the Latin anthro rather than anthropos with the Greek zoo. But the story goes is that the original editor felt that anthropozoos does not, I can't even say it, flow off the tongue as well. So it became known as anthrozoos. And this journal is now managed by ISAS. So ISAS, the International Society of Anthrozoology, was formed following a gathering of interdisciplinary researchers, again, this time in Harrogate, England, at the Wolfen Symposium on Pets, Benefits and Practices. So we've got the second thread is coming from that side. So despite their early focus on companion animals, and they're still very focused on companion animals and animal-assisted therapies, the ISAS founders, Lynette and Benjamin Hart, Erica Friedman, Dennis Turner, James Serple, and John Bradshaw, and I'm reading this quote now at the bottom here from the ISAS website. So they joined together to promote academic, scientific, and scholarly research into all aspects of human-animal interactions and to foster interactions between researchers in this area on an international basis. So that slide became quite busy. Next slide. Okay, so there's several major and minor programs in the US as well as I'm sorry, why is my phone ringing? Stop. It never rings. Sorry about that. I had that as a timer. That really threw me. I'm sorry. What was my point? Oh yeah, so there's several programs established and also several programs at the undergrad and master's level in Europe and Australia. But Exeter, and this gets on to why I call myself an amphizoologist. I do have a point here, I promise. So Exeter is the first university to establish an amphizoology PhD program with their first doctorate awarded in 2017. And this is currently the only dedicated PhD program with that title. Though of course there are many human-animal studied focused individuals and even now departments typically located within the traditional disciplines who also consider themselves amphizoologists. And that, so as I said, that's the main reason I call myself an amphizoologist, because it's written on my PhD certificate. And I threw in this picture of me at my graduation wearing the silly hat and all that. It's the only picture that I have of me stood there looking a bit awkward. But more importantly, my research methods and theoretical frameworks, they draw from both social anthropology and sociology. I dabble a little bit in ethology, and I try not to get lost in philosophy. And I collaborate with researchers trained in a variety of the traditional disciplines, including anthropology, history, philosophy, and behavioral sciences. So I consider myself an interdisciplinary researcher, but I strive towards being transdisciplinary. Just having a look at the time there. So as a relatively new academic field, amphizoology adapts, and devises new methodological approaches to address questions concerning interactions between humans and other animals. And the first generation of researchers calling themselves amphizoologists were trained in these traditional disciplines. And as such, the questions originally approached by amphizoologists, whether they called themselves such or not, were inherently multidisciplinary, encompassing methods and theories from more than one discipline. And so this schematic was adopted from McPhee et al. 2018, and I didn't put the reference up there, sorry. But anyway, I changed it up a bit myself and added, I changed up the examples and I added amphizoology, which is AZ here. So as researchers began to coordinate their efforts, researchers interested in human-animal interactions began to coordinate their efforts. Research becomes more cross-disciplinary, drawing upon knowledge and insights from 2 or more disciplines. And then interdisciplinary research involves this integrative and reciprocal interaction approach that leads to a new level of thinking within each discipline. And that works whether you think of amphizoology as a distinct discipline, a subfield, or just a broad study area that spans multiple fields. And then the next level is transdisciplinary research, which transcends these boundaries of the traditional disciplines to become something new, and arguably best describes how the field of amphizoology is progressing, or how I'd like to think it is. And so some definitions of transdisciplinary research even go beyond academia and describe the creation of a unity of intellectual frameworks beyond the disciplinary perspectives. So transdisciplinary research is when the knowledge produces, creates change within the individual perspectives, but also feeds back into the disciplines themselves. So So yeah, so together with peers that I met through Exeter University, I'm currently writing up a collaborative project that entailed a content analysis of 4 decades of scholarship. And I might add, we didn't read all the papers, we looked at the abstracts, published in 19 journals with a human-animal focus. So shown here is on the left is the intro slide from when we presented this data earlier this year, and I'd be happy to talk more about that over coffee. But essentially, this study is an analysis of the empirical data, and it complements some of the opinion pieces written by leaders in the field. And then as early career researchers, myself and a couple of my peers have been honoured to speak with several of these leaders in the field, including the likes of Lynette Hart, Ken Shapiro, Hal Herzog and Aubrey Fine. And they joined us on our podcast to talk about how they perceive the past, present and future of the field, and whether they feel amphizoology is coming together or diverging, especially in relation to scholars who lean more towards the critical animal studies and research activism. And it's also interesting to look at what students are focusing on and what other early career researchers have to say, because we're shaping the future of this field. And then going back to this notion of transdisciplinary research, I really embrace the idea of amphizoologists connecting with and even collaborating with practitioners and others who can best inform the research, but also translate it back to real world issues. Right, and then as a graduate of Exeter University, I subscribe to Exeter's Amphizoology of Symbiotic Ethics, EASE notion of amphizoology as symbiotic ethics, which considers all animals to be ethically significant beings worthy of dignity and respect. And the basic principles listed here, and I put a reference to the website where you can find some more references to this. But basically, this approach fosters an empathetic living with or symbiosis or living alongside other animals. It maintains a respect for them as autonomous subjects, particularly in relation to our research, and it attempts to grasp the perspectives of these other than human animals, as well as those of our human subjects. And it seeks a holistic understanding of the context within which these interactions occur. And practice it, and this approach prescribes that academic research concerned with understanding these trans-species interactions should have some meaningful practical application and ultimately improve the lives of our research subjects. So more than just academic curiosity is required to justify the research, especially when it involves intruding upon the private lives of these other animals. And this less anthropocentric ideology is what first drew me to the program. And this approach, so it considers more than human animals as conscious actors who are more than material accessories to human societies and endeavors to give them a voice. And this echoes the anthropological cultural shift of the latter part of the last century, where scientists or anthropologists began engaging with their research subjects and collaborating with them, and especially the descendants of the cultures they were studying. So in my own research, I attempt to bring in the feline perspective and apply a less anthropocentric lens through which to analyze my fieldwork. Right. So why cats? Well, I've always taken an interest in the cats I meet out and about, either locally or when traveling. And now social media is testimony to the fact that I'm not the only person who enjoys seeing happy, healthy cats wandering around, as illustrated by some of these memes that I just pulled up. And if you go on the internet, it's full of cats, people taking pictures of cats. So some cats you see out and about, they're clearly pets. Others are lightly stray or abandoned pets, whereas others are free-living cats who were born on the streets. And so over the years, I've grown particularly fond of seeing Mediterranean street cats while on vacation or traveling, especially as for the most part, they often appear healthy, happy, and part of the community. And then a little side story. So in Sardinia, just before, it was like 6 months before the pandemic, in 2019, and just before I started my PhD, I was sat outside a restaurant. It was around closing time, and I watched this mother cat bring her kittens from the cliffs where these cats live. She crossed the road, looked both ways, crossed the road with her kittens, and went to the back door of the restaurant, and the kitchen staff put down food bowls for them. And so what really draws me to these cats is that liminal status, that they live alongside humans. They are often cared for by locals, restaurant owners, or dedicated colony caretakers. And many of these cats, they're very human friendly, but they're not pets, they're not companion animals, and neither are they wildlife. And so anecdotal evidence suggested that not all visitors, not all tourists are impressed by the local free-living cats. And some consider them dirty, unsightly, or a nuisance. Whereas others pity them simply because they do not belong to a human household. They think that they can't be happy because they're not a companion animal, even if they look healthy and happy. So my current academic study focuses on my current academic study focus is built upon wanting to know more about the interactions between cats and tourists and locals. However, my doctoral research focused more broadly on roaming cats, both owned and unowned, and this so-called indoor-outdoor cat debate. And because my fieldwork stage was during the 2020 and 2021 pandemic lockdowns, much of my research ended up being done online. So during my PhD, I performed an analysis of discourses surrounding roaming cats. And one thing that was apparent at the onset was these many different ideas about cats, what they are, who they are, and what they should or should not be doing. And these generalizations, especially regarding the management and care of cats, often failed to account for differences between individual cats and their circumstances. So before we go any further, I want to just clarify some of the terms and classifications I use, or that are generally used to differentiate groups of cats based on their location, relationship to humans, or their socialization status. And I am talking exclusively about the domestic cat, Felis catus. Even if some members of this species do live wild, they live wild-like lives far away from humans, that they're still the same species. They're not one of the wildcat species. And this cartoon comes from International Cat Care and illustrates some of the key considerations regarding how we view cats. And they can move between categories, so these are not fixed. So feral. I tend not to use the word feral And if you care to know more about my reasoning, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards, or you can read a paper that I co-authored that unpacks this more. But also the colloquial usage of feral, it's not limited to rural cats, and is used interchangeably with street cats or strays. However, my preferred term for all unowned cats, I put it at the top, is free living, but this term is very broad and it does not differentiate between urban and rural cats. And this urban-rural distinction, it is important in terms of both the impact they have on wildlife populations, and that, of course, will depend on the larger ecological context, but also on their socialization to humans. So socialization refers to this 3-month window during kittenhood where a cat becomes accustomed to humans. And unsocialized adults struggle, and I don't want to say that they can't, but they really do struggle to adjust to living with humans. So there's this 3-month window when they're most susceptible to, learning to live alongside humans and learning the social, just being comfortable around humans. And so differentiating unsocialized cats from stray or abandoned companions is an important welfare consideration. Because many, especially these unsocialized cats, they are better off being left alone or provided for in managed colonies. And yet even some strays not only survive, but thrive as unowned cats, whereas others really do not. And they are better off being adopted, taken to a shelter, or adopted into a human household. So this next, so this is my table. And it's not as fun as the iCat pictogram, but it displays the various ways that cats are categorized or can be categorized based on ownership status, provisioning, reproduction, movement, and socialization. And so for those who are concerned about predation by cats, the socialization status and ownership is less relevant because they're outdoors, they can still hunt. But from a welfare perspective, socialization absolutely does matter, because unsocialized cats generally do not do well if you put them into shelters or try and make them live in human households. And at the bottom two, so below the yellow and green, or including the yellow and green, are my preferred terms. So as I mentioned briefly earlier on, I prefer companion animal over pet. I cringe at the word fur baby. But that's a term that's often used by my research participants. So I prefer guardian over owner, although ownership often best reflects the legal status of the cat-human relationship. And I define a cat guardian as somebody who is responsible for an individual cat's welfare and any damage they may cause, which is distinct to those that I refer to as caretakers. And this is when it gets confusing, because some people they like the term caretaker for all cat owners. But I define caretakers as people who look after free living cats. So they care for these colony cats. And unless the cat's wearing a collar, roaming companion cats can be indistinguishable from free living street cats. And this is especially so with stray or abandoned companions who are fully socialized. So they behave just like regular companion house cats. And then some companion cats are kept indoors or confined to an indoor enclosure. More often in the US, they'll be walked on a leash. So they do go out, but they're always controlled. So I refer to all these cats as indoor cats. And this, so as I mentioned, there's this growing trend around the world to keep cats confined, both for their own safety or because of concerns about predation by cats. And even amongst cat guardians, the so-called indoor versus outdoor cat debates can get pretty heated with strong opinions and emotions on both sides. It can get pretty crazy on social media and in online discourses in particular. And that's even before you bring in this anti-cat element that exists and the various conservation concerns. So my PhD examined discourses surrounding roaming cats, both owned and unowned, companion cats. I already said that, didn't I? Sorry. So I'm not going to talk about this today in any great detail, but I provided a link to some of my papers in case you're interested. But essentially, I performed a discourse analysis of online reader comments responding to various news articles and media about outdoor versus indoor cats. From both, these voices came from the US, primarily from the US and the UK, but also some Australian and other bits and pieces in there. But it was very much an international exchange of ideas about cats. And these included a range of perspectives from cat guardians, those with conservation concerns about wildlife predation by cats, and this disturbing minority of cat haters. And in my thesis, I concluded it's complicated. It was a few more words than that, but basically it's complicated. But this pictogram attempts to illustrate some of the variables that affect different cats and highlight some of the key issues arising from this indoor versus outdoor cat debate, as well as the different types of cats. So yeah, discourse surrounding roaming companion cats in part arises from guardians wanting to do what's best for their cat. Whether that is to protect them from danger or perceived danger, or a desire to provide them with an enriching life from going outside and exploring the world. And my recent paper in Anthrozoos used the framework of pet parenting styles to examine how roles and responsibilities of cat guardians are constructed differently in relation to this indoor-outdoor cat debate, and how feline pet parenting norms might be changing in contemporary risk societies that are increasingly promoting practices that restrict the roaming of pet cats. And then there are real issues surrounding predation, which is a serious problem in some locations, but arguably not so much in others. And I'm thinking specifically a lot of the literature that comes from the Australian outback and the impact feral or very rural living cats are having there. And I've written about this using a moral panic framework, whereby something or someone is termed as transgressive and a threat. And then in this case, the feral cat is the feral folk devil, the bad guy. And but the subsequent reactions are disproportionate to any real threat. So what I found that in these discourses, it was very often not about any ecological threat, and it was more about a dislike of neighborhood cats. So cats defecating on lawns and just existing. So people that just didn't like their untidy neighbors' cats. And then there was sort of, a bit about classism and that mixed into that kind of discourse. And I'll just add that I'm not denying that cats can pose a serious ecological problem. It's just that it's way more nuanced than that. There's simply all cats everywhere are a problem, and especially in Europe, where the ecosystems evolved alongside wild cat species. And I should just point out that my research interests have been focused on urban cats and rural and farm cats. They're very different to free-living urban cats. And now I get on to the fun stuff. So this brings me on to my current research, which is situated at the intersection of tourism, migration, and human-animal studies. And this is a multispecies ethnographic study focusing on relationships between residents, visitors, and a colony of free-living cats inhabiting a sun and sea style vacation destination on the Costa del Sol in Spain. And I use the term I use a transspecies perspective. I use the transspecies lens through which to examine how meaning and culture are co-created across the species boundaries. And I proffer that transspecies is a better term than multispecies because it more fully acknowledges how interactions that change the actants as part of a process that occurs between the species, across the species. So during my stay here, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll be preparing a manuscript based on my latest field work. So in the next few slides, I'll give you a very brief introduction to the site and the published work, and then I'll share some of my observations and themes that I plan to unpack more as I write. So I absolutely invite feedback. Yeah, so this research focuses on cats living along a 1.6 kilometer stretch of the Torremolinos promenade. So starting at the left, just out of the frame, where there's various restaurants and bars, and then continuing along around this bend. And I don't know if you can see this sort of cliff bush area. That's where a lot of the cats sleep. And then around the other side of the bend, where there's more bars and restaurants that various cats, cats. A lot of these bars and restaurants have their own resident cat or cat that's their local or whatever. So tourism in this region is it's this classic sun and sea style budget holiday. And there's like this culture of British migrants, sometimes referred to as residential tourists, who live there seasonally or more permanently. But they're the kind of transient. Residential tourism is a word that's been used to describe them. So the Torremolinos Promenade Colony currently represents a successful trap neuter release program. So that's where you catch these cats up. You don't need to trap them; you can just pick them up and take them. But so they'll get them neutered and then released back to the colony. And although there'll always be new or stray abandoned cats showing up, I last visited during kitten season, and there were no kittens to be seen. And the colony is overseen by Feline Malaga, who do provide some medical care, and volunteers with a license from the council to officially feed the cats. Although they feed them, they pay for the food out of their own pocket. So my research is informed by Professor Karen O'Reilly's ethnographic account of Brits living on the Costa del Sol. And a lot of her fieldwork was done in the 90s, and this book was published in 2000. But she has written more since. She's now an emeritus professor. This brings in this concept of transnational identity and community building, primarily in relation to the British expats, transient residents, and their interactions with the Spanish locals. And their identity is often enacted through involvement with various clubs and charity work, because the demographic is often their retirees or early retirees. And so this is where the cats come in, is the feeding or the desire to help cats is also sort of comes in with this charity work. And it's an activity that unites like-minded individuals. And so the slide that I showed earlier of the feeders, the woman she's a British woman who's lived there for several years, and her Spanish friend, and they're the two official feeders. But also the cats are not passive entities, they're rather active agents in this transspecies community building. So I'm trying to bring in this transspecies component. I'm trying to draw upon this concept, or I'm drawing upon this concept of interspecies intersubjectivity and this idea of transspecies co-creation of culture. So intersubjectivity is, the shared mind between conscious, subjective minds where shared meaning is made. And the recognition that other than human animals also possess subjective minds has led scholars to develop this concept of interspecies intersubjectivity. And I adopt the term humano-cat cultures from Dr. Philippe Yaros to describe the relationship between companion cats and humans. And so although these colony cats, they're free living, many are more human friendly than most house cats I know. So they occupy this liminal space between free living cats and basically companion animals or pets that live in the rocks. And these are my images, and I did screen them for any nudity. I think we're safe. It's they're not so bad in Spain with the nudity, but I did check. So emergent themes from preliminary fieldwork that I did in 2022 and analysis of TripAdvisor comments are now published in this chapter in Emerging Voices for Animals in Tourism. And this research, it focused on establishments along the promenade where the cats live. And I'm going to whiz through this a little bit. How are we doing for time? Yeah, I'm going to whiz through this because it's already published, and you can read the details of the methods if you're interested. But very briefly, almost 100 of the English TripAdvisor reviews mention the cats in some capacity. Now, this was only 2% of the total English language reviews. And this is an important point because it suggests that most visitors really are indifferent to the cats, to the point of not even mentioning them. However, I coded these as being pro-cat, anti-cat, or just neutral. So those coded as neutral were often ambiguous, and it was not always clear if the observation was intended to be a positive or negative criticism or just merely a side note. But it is evidence of the abundance of cats when they're referenced in the context of complaints about food. So, for example, a neutral comment would be a complaint about the food, say even the cats wouldn't eat it, or to complain about lack of hospitality, such as the cats are treated better than the guests. So that speaks to abundance of cats that has been ongoing, for over 10 years, actually longer than that. And more people complained about cats in the hotel reviews, and these complaints, negative comments, tended to cite noise and untidiness of multiple cats, and this perception of cats as dirty and unsightly, which relates to this concept of tourist entitlement and also this anthropocentric attitude. However, many comments also express joy regarding the cat's presence, which is something that is corroborated by my fieldwork observations. So during my most recent fieldwork, notes and video footage was used to capture and record the daily habits and behaviours of unowned cats living along the Torremolinos promenade, so that 1.6 stretch. I went out different times of the day, walking, sitting and eating, much like a regular tourist. So I included this. So I was not at all conspicuous or out of place taking cat photos. And without even trying, I have several photos like this one of people taking photos or videos of cats. And from this, several organic conversations about the cats arose from people just simply acknowledging my own cat admiring activity. So I was taking pictures of cats and just observing them. And people would come up and like, oh, you love cats too, me too. And then they'd often continue to just share or overshare how they miss their own cats back home. And so although I did not conduct formal interviews, I didn't conceal my identity as a researcher during these impromptu conversations. So I was very transparent. And while it was not my intention to formally recruit human informants during this trip, I ended up befriending the two official feeders. So they mentioned a British-born woman and her Spanish friend, actually on my first day. anyway, I took care, I always take care to not approach or force my attention on any of the cats. So any interactions were feline driven. And I do not, I try not to share any potentially identifying imagery of humans, although I do share cat photos. And feline privacy is something I am conscious of and continue to grapple with a little bit. So images and videos of many of my feline informants can be found online, YouTube videos everywhere. These cats that I show pictures of, they're everywhere online. But as researchers, I do feel we have a responsibility to protect and respect the dignity of our more than human participants. So yeah, I try not to share images of cats just doing more ridiculous or less. So I try and respect that dignity. And you can read more about my thoughts on this blog I wrote. It was during my PhD, and it's just some of my thoughts. So I'd love to hear any feedback on that. But that's something that I continue to grapple with. Okay, here we go. So data included 500 photos and 1,100 video clips, which ranged from between 1 second to 125 seconds, but the medium length was 11 seconds. Totaling, it was like almost 300 minutes of footage of 51 cats, or 51 clearly identifiable distinct individuals. So this isn't the best diagram, but essentially it shows the stretch, the 1.6 stretch of these 51 cats. And don't check my math, don't count them. So cats seen on less than 3 outings are indicated by light grey paws, and those that I saw between 4 and 10 times are brown. But those encountered on more than 10 outings, I put as black here. And so the majority of my data surrounds only 25 cats who were documented almost every day, often on multiple outings. And the cats hung out in the same small general areas. I tried to indicate their location, the locations. Obviously, they're not out in the sea, but it sort of points back to where on this pathway that they generally hung out. And so the cats hung out in the same general areas indicated here, quite often they were seen as a bonded pair, or the same small groups. And this is something I previously observed, and it's been documented by others studying cat colony behavior. And 8 of the cats I recognized from field work in 2022. And you can spot, if you go onto YouTube and Instagram, you can actually identify a lot of the cats there. They've been filmed a lot. This is on the next. So the black cat can be seen most days on this same rock. And my human informant says that she has been around for at least 4 years, probably a lot longer. And she jumps up on that rock, especially when the small children, grabby children, just out of the reach. But she's almost always in that very small area, often on top of the rock. And then this cat that I dubbed Fisherman's Friend can often be seen sat next to a fisherman, or one particular fisherman, she likes to snuggle up next to tourists. They sit on the wall, she'll come up, she'll sit next to you or sit in your lap. And I have a picture of her here, in 2022. She's I don't know how old she is. She's not a young cat. And the ginger cat on the rocks was also in the first slide, and this cat's also been around for several years too. So future research would be to interview the feeders and locals and get really in-depth biographies on these cats. But now I'm going to just share some of the preliminary findings, thematic analysis of observations and interactions with these cats based on that trip. It was in April, May of this year. So I'm following up on several themes, but probably the most notable was how many tourists openly expressed joy at seeing cats. And I overheard several variations of the exclamation, "Oh, look, another kitty." And I watched a grown man practically skip along the walkway to look at a group of cats sat in the shade of the bushes. And I observed people of all ages, genders, and various nationalities doting over these cats. They were taking photographs, filming them, petting them, sometimes asking for consent, or at least being mindful of the cat's reaction. Other times, not so much. They would just grab the cats, pick them up. And for the most part, many of the cats tolerated this. Happy with it. Although some cats were adept at maneuvering out of reach of overly grabby humans. So there were cats that would be quite happy to sit next to you, but if you started, looking like you were going to cross those boundaries, they'd jump up out of reach or up into the cliffs. So this also shows around feeding time. There was always a crowd that gathered. So as I noted previously with the TripAdvisor analysis, there do exist negative attitudes towards the cats. However, in practice, not so much. So apart from, I did see one lady, she was hissing and stamping her foot at a passing cat. But apart from that, I did not witness any maliciousness directed towards the cats. Another little story. So when I was sat on a step with this cat was curled up next to me, and his family group, like, they stepped around me. They said, no, don't move, because they saw the cat there. And the man in the group, he was like, "Oh, I know, love, I'm a cat lover too." And the British, sort of typical British tourist there. But this appears to be the overriding sentiment, that many of the visitors are pro-cat. And a common theme is that the holidaymakers, they were reminded of their own cats back home, who they miss. They just love cats. And there's been several studies published elsewhere on tourist attitudes towards street cats and dogs, more often dogs, but street animals, and perceptions of welfare, and sort of how this differs between cultures. And I'm in the process of contrasting my analysis to these to look for commonalities and distinctions related to the different cultural contexts, the animal welfare provisions, and also the touristic landscape. So, of course, if the visitors think that the cats, even if they're perfectly healthy, if they think that they're a problem, then that's a problem for the tourist industry. And there's all sorts of variables going on there. And then so during my doctoral research, I posed this question to various cat appreciation groups on Facebook. So there's lots of Facebook groups dedicated to cats, cat lovers. Okay, nearly done. So I posed the question, what does feral mean to you? And the corresponding manuscript, it's got rejected a few times, and I'm not quite sure. I probably need to just think about my analysis more deeply. But anyway, it is interesting how many people talk about how they would define feral. So when people were describing feral, they'd use terms like wild or wildcat to define feral, but what they actually meant by wild was not always clear. Sometimes they were referring to a behavior, so they meant wild-like behavior. Other times they were implying that these cats were a distinct species, they were a wild species. And homeless was another term often used synonymously with feral. And it was actually interesting to overhear similar phrases and ways of thinking about these Spanish cats that manifested in response to that initial Facebook question. However, these cats are not wild-like in their behavior, and they do have a home. So on my first day of this latest field trip, this little black cat shown here jumped up on my lap and snuggled down on my lap. And she has, I don't know if you can actually see in there, the little snipped corner of the ear is indicative of that she's been trapped, neutered, and released back to the colony. And that's a common indicator in a lot of cats, around the world, that they have been, to stop them being retrapped and taken back to the vet multiple times. And then every day I encounter her in the same spot, just watching people go by. And this level, so I experienced this level of human friendliness from many of the cats. And so it's slightly related, obviously related to the fact that the locals and visitors feed the cats. Sometimes cat treats, other times leftovers from their plates, and that's a whole other discussion that is also problematic. But yeah, combined with the fact that these cats haven't really experienced trauma at the hands of humans. But also, so the current population is largely comprised of stray or abandoned former companions who have been socialized as kittens. And I would hypothesize that actually any kittens born here would also become socialized just because they have regular interactions with the colony caretakers and visitors. Anyway, so the phrase "the wild cats" was often overheard, as was the phrase "they are homeless," and neither is really true. And it actually irks my informant to hear them referred to as wild cats. And when she hears that, she'll turn around and correct people by explaining that they are pet cats. But then this can be confusing because it leads to the misunderstanding that they have human homes that they go back to. And actually, a couple of the cats do. Most of the cats, they live in the caves and bushes along the promenade. However, most are stray or abandoned pets, or at least they're as socialized to humans as as companion cats. And this makes them distinct from street-born cats and cats born in more rural locations. So they really are like outdoor pets. All right, so yeah. I'd also hear expressions of sadness that the cats had no home. And my immediate thoughts were that this is their home, and they are loved by the people who feed them, especially those that go every day to feed them. And then on the other side, I also heard several variations of, they just have the best life, don't they? But do they have the best life, or at least a good life? And I'm not going to answer that question today. But I do want to point out that it's easy to adopt a romantic view of these cats. But of course, they do get sick from being fed inappropriate foods. And my informant said that several have been injured in the last year alone, just by cyclists and scooter riders going too fast around the bend. And some medical provision for sick or injured cats is available, but not as readily as it might be for a pampered companion cat, but it is there. There are also multiple senior cats. And I'm not sure how old this one, also shown here on the rocks, that I dubbed Fisherman Friend, is. And although she did not appear overly distressed and she is eating, her coat looks in poor condition and she's clearly unwell. And thinking about her invokes conflicting emotions in me that I've not fully processed. But there were other cats too who looked visibly unwell. And indeed, on request of one of the colony caretakers, I captured footage of a particular cat. They wanted footage of her to send to the vet. And then there's another cat who's on a vet recommended liquid diet. And I overheard people commenting on her skinniness. And yes, she is too thin, and that's a concern. However, it also concerns me that her condition and that of senior cats gives the impression that all the cats live poorly, when actually they're just old. Animals get old and sick. And this says a lot about how old and sick animals are viewed more broadly. So naturally, people don't like seeing frail or sickly animals, but does that give us the right to pity them, hide them away, or even euthanize them? And of course, there will be strong opinions and caveats regarding level of suffering, what is acceptable, what is not. And my analysis is really trying to hone in on this notion of, or sort of what this means for aging animals in general, but particularly this notion of an aging colony of cats. All right, so that's kind of the status of the research at the moment, is that I'm reflecting upon some of these emerging themes and trying to tease out various threads before I make any solid conclusions from my analysis. But to summarize, the cat cultures of Torremolinos, the cat culture of Torremolinos is one of feline sociality, human friendliness, and this predominantly positive engagement with pro-cat locals and visitors. Many of the cats express affiliative behaviors towards tourists and initiate contact with strangers. Others are more timid and will hide from tourists that come out to the feeders. Several will tolerate closeness but move away from humans who try and touch them. And this colony, as I mentioned, is comprised of adult cats, many of whom have been there for many years. And aside from the squabbles during feeding time, the cats mostly get along and have established micro territories and favorite spots. And there are several bonded pairs. And yeah, so the cats and the humans are also part of this larger multi-species community. And I haven't talked so much about that, but this includes the pigeons who live alongside the cats, eat their food, and occasionally come into conflict with both the cats and their feeders. There's one cat that the feeder has to stand next to her while she eats and shoos away the pigeons. At the times, of course, the cats chase the pigeons. And then there's the cat-dog interactions. And yeah, a lot of these cats, they're not intimidated by dogs. It's a little bit over time, but just this is the last slide. So future research plans, when I finish this, so I'm already jumping ahead, but future research plans would include quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews with visitors, residents, cat caretakers and veterinarians, business owners, and the local authorities, as well as feline personality and behavioral studies. So the research contributes to tourism, migration, and human-animal studies by examining how attitudes and relations between local cats, Spanish-born residents, and British expats relate to the concepts of tourist entitlement, classism, and anthropocentrism. And furthermore, it seeks to build upon Karen O'Reilly's work on transnational identity and community building amongst British expats in Spain, and to develop this further to the idea of trans-species community building. And yeah, so in many respects, I see parallels between the liminal status of resident Brits and free-living cats. So the Brits in Spain have been a subject of a lot of bad press. And while this is not entirely unwarranted, there is this underlying classism in how the British press has framed a predominantly working class demographic. And likewise, there is this stigma around free-living cats as pests, carriers of disease, and also sometimes, perpetrators of ecological collapse. However, in both cases, the reality is always more complex and nuanced. And thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, or suggestions. And I'm not brave enough to practice my Czech. I had my first Czech language course, and I wanted to say thank you for your attention. So it's děkuji vaši pozornost.
Okay, so thank you for your enriching talk, and now it's time to open discussion. So are there any questions? Okay, Philip Eroš.
Thank you for your presentation.
Microphone, please.
Oh.
My question is about your last slide. So you mentioned this phenomenon of classism. So I understand it that in the background there might be some post-Marxist agenda. So it means some struggles between classes. But in your particular case, so you say that there is some kind of hostility between British tourists and local Spanish people who are on working class, or I'm not sure that I
was more so how the I guess the British press portray the the sun and sea style budget holiday. It's sort of the cheap holiday, and it sort of goes back to the 70s, 80s, where more people could go on holiday, and there's this reputation of the sort of working class Brits being a bit loud, a bit drunken, and also the perception that they don't try and assimilate with the local culture. Some that's true, and so that's the researcher Karen O'Reilly did sort of looked at that a bit more. Now I'm losing my so that's sort of portrayed as being the common, the uncouth tourist. So it's not sort of like a highbrow holiday destination.
Okay.
And there's I saw a lot of that with the discourses with neighborhood cats, that it was the lower socioeconomical areas that tend to embrace colony cats and want to help feed the stray cats, whereas the more affluent areas with the nice manicured lawns, they were the ones that were complaining about the neighbors' cats pooping on their garden or trespassing. So there seems to be some sort of element there of I don't know if that really answered the question, but
I think that I understand it much more now. So actually, this is for this area of Costa del Sol. It's not the destination for wealthy people.
No, it's
for working class.
Yeah.
And so tourists are kind of working class. But what are and I see your argument about the liminal status of this migrating British people, and also of course from other nations, and the liminal status of cats. I really like this correction. But what about the Spaniards, who are the locals? They are probably quite wealthy because of the tourist area, or not really?
I mean, this is what I'd really like to dig into a bit more. So a lot of them are sort of that's their livelihood, the tourist industry. And so I'd really like to do surveys with the Spanish locals to really try and sort of see what their actual perspective is to the cats and the tourists. I'm kind of losing my train of thought now. I had so this came up several times, that from the British regular tourists and the residents, the migrants, I call them expats because they do really kind of maintain their British identity. But this kind of throwaway comment that the Spanish don't like the cats, and I don't think that's true at all from what I've seen. But this, I guess it goes back to the sort of the regulations and getting a license to feed the cats and the bureaucracy. But like I said, so the two that were feeding, one was the Spanish guy, the other was the British lady, and they worked together to feed the cats. So I think for the most part so walking along the promenade, you hear more English than Spanish or other languages. So probably these cats have, that may be less true in the winter season, actually thinking about it, but then there's just less people there. But sorry, I don't have a good answer. I sort of waffling on then with ideas that what I think is underlying there. But it's very interesting, because that whole promenade walk, it is all vacation homes, hotels, restaurants. But there are residential houses at the back, and there's a couple of cats that they know, the feeders know live with people in the residences, but they just come out and hang out with these other cats and sometimes show up for feeding time.
Oh, thank you. And there are another 3 questions, but I suppose that you were first.
So like I've got a kind of like 2-part question. So have things changed, do you think, since Brexit, in the sense of like there's maybe more hostility towards Brits, and therefore is the hostility towards Brits kind of a proxy, as a almost proxy towards hostility of cats because they're somehow linked, or do you think that that's misguided?
Yeah, I don't think that's sort of really true in this area. I think it's more yeah, because it's very insular, the actual I mean, yeah, so it's probably different if you sort of go out more into the broader Spanish culture and the wider, but yeah, I don't know. So I mean, so Karen O'Reilly did write a little bit about sort of post-Brexit and some of these issues, but yeah, I think it more relates to, does it increase hostility? I don't know. I think that it's more sort of more creates problems, but then maybe it does bring out the hostility because those that didn't speak Spanish, they'd like been living there for 10, 20 years, they didn't speak Spanish, so they were struggling to get residency. And so, yeah, again, I don't really know, but that would be my, and how would it, I don't think it really would affect the cats at all. I don't know.
Because like you see a lot of like in the British press about how like the Spanish are trying to like reduce tourism because like tourists are taking over various different places like Barcelona and all this. So I just wondered if it had like some kind of impact there. But if you say no, then yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean this has totally been taken over by tourism. This sort of very small for like decades. Yeah, I don't know. That's something that would perhaps come out of more field work and just. Yeah, I'm trying to. Anyway, carrots.
Okay, Preston. Now it's your turn.
So I want to ask about. So early in the talk, you said all animals are ethically significant beings worthy of dignity and respect as autonomous subjects, and of course these words can mean different things in different contexts, right? Like humans, in some sense, are paradigm cases of beings that are worthy of dignity and respect, and as autonomous subjects. But then, of course, if you're a child, then my duties toward you, things I would do to an adult that would be violations of dignity or respect, maybe aren't for children, at least some of them. And then when it comes to animals, it seems like I'm not even sure that those categories apply, or if they do, they're in a much diluted way. And maybe this is something that you could take on board, but I just heard that and was like, ooh, wow. I mean, they're autonomous. They're not in Kant's sense, right? They don't give themselves the moral law. And then the issue is like, what sort of duties do we owe them as things that can suffer in certain ways? Sure. But like one thing that you said at the end was that you were worried about taking pictures of cats in ways that would be, ridiculous? You were worried about it. But I mean, a cat will lick its butt in front of you. So like, do we really have to worry about like taking a picture of a cat doing something we think is ridiculous? Does it have dignity? I mean, I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I could just talk a lot about this. Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that because I do share pictures of my cats doing ridiculous things, and I think that it's, as long as it's well intended and you're not doing something that could potentially cause sort of abuse, like dressing them up in Halloween costumes that perpetrate the idea that they are okay with that. I don't know. I think then that kind of goes more on or sharing them sort of in distress. But I think, just doing cute or stupid things I actually think that that's okay. But it does bring back to this issue of privacy and dignity. And going back to what you're saying earlier, I think there's two different. So when you're thinking about wild animals living in the wild, it's a different scenario to domesticated animals that have been domesticated. They rely on human, and sort of our obligations then to care for them are slightly different to respecting the autonomy of a wild wild living animals, and then but yeah, there's actually a lot there. But I do think there's good parallels with children, and this sort of comes up a lot, is you can ask very small children for assent. So you might not be able to get their informed consent. They don't know why they're doing it. You're asking them to do I don't know, I'm thinking like a psychology experiment where you're getting them to put little boxes in. They might not know, they're not given their informed consent, but they're given assent. So if they're screaming and saying, no, mummy, take me home, then it's obvious they're not giving the assent. And that same principle can apply to getting animals to do these sort of behavioral things. So you can't get their informed consent, but you can make sure that they're assenting, that they're comfortable, that they're not distressed, and they're not sort of but then and so that's in the research context, but then you can also think sort of with medical procedures, sort of a small child might not want to have this surgery, but it's in their best interest. And the same can then apply to companion animals. So of course they don't want to go to the vet, but then it's sort of, but then you are like you're treating them like infants, and that comes up a lot with companion animals and pet cats. It's sort of how much is, it's actually really cool to kind of think about it, but you get your head in knots. And I think there are a lot of parallels to sort of look about how we get consent and assent and our ethical considerations towards children, and what is best for them versus what is best for are we really doing this in their own best interests? So basically it's sort of an ideology in a way, as a framework or a guideline, but it's almost impossible to really stick to that.
I appreciate that. It is interesting too to think about the ways in which you've got disanalogies and
but I'd love to talk more about the privacy issue, because it's something that it can get on the ridiculous side, or like and I shouldn't say that, but it can get when you start thinking about it philosophically, sort of how much should you be invading their privacy, and especially with wildlife cameras, and even though it's non-intrusive and they don't know they're being watched, I don't think that's a massive problem, but it does raise these issues of anyway.
Okay, I'm not sure. Yeah, Manuel was the third.
Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting. I've got a clarification question, although it's very similar to what Preston just said about symbiotic ethics. On the slide, you mentioned autonomous subjects, which you just spoke about, Preston. And in passing, it wasn't on the slide, but you mentioned it. You mentioned conscious actors. And when you said that, I was sort of thinking of the idea of sentience, like, being aware and feeling and stuff. And it made me think of Frans de Waal's, before he passed, I think it was his last book, Mama's Last Hug. And in that book, he talks about 4 levels of sentience. So different types, certain animals can feel more conscious of, specific things, chimps, elephants, orca whales, for example. But it's just clarification. So with symbiotic ethics, does that mean like all these autonomous subjects are equal? And if they are, how would that work with what Frans de Waal postulates with the 4 levels of sentience? I'm just curious what your opinion is on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that all animals can suffer, they can feel pain, so I guess it's within sort of the framework that it would fit into is based on the level of understanding or I'm not quite sure how to articulate what I'm thinking here. But so the issues with like an ant would be very different from, say, a chimpanzee who is able to very much human-like with the complexities of feeling emotion, and they might actually feel something if you're making fun of them in front of them where they can see, whereas an ant would, I guess they wouldn't like to be isolated from their colony or squished. So yeah, there is some sort of, it's not like everybody's equal in that, what's the word? Yeah, I'm not sure as I've really clarified that so well. Yeah, it's a problem, right?
Consciousness is, of course, a very complicated topic,
and even
especially
amongst humans too, right? It's
of course, yeah. And then when you look at, like, Jane Goodall's research, chimps, the bonobos, and they're very similar to us. The way they move and the way they take care of their young, for example. But when we go on to birds, for example, then we're sort of further away from us. But I know, for example, that the African grey parrot has passed a marshmallow test that you can do with small kids. But then they changed the framework and the methodology, so there are certain tests, like theory of mind as well, you can do with chimps, for example. Yeah, it was more just clarification with the idea of symbiotic ethics, because I think there are like a worm or an ant is obviously different than a chimp or even an African grey parrot. But I was just curious
yeah, and I was going to say, then it goes back to the question of what is a human and what is the difference, because every criteria that you think that defines humans, you can find an example. So if a human isn't conscious, if that they're still human, but they can't think or give consent, or it's
I made
thank
I
you.
made note of the symbiotic ethics website and a few of the references, so I'm going to do my own homework and check it out and see if I can find
it was coined by a philosopher anyway, so you you can
but we can talk about it more throughout the semester, so thank you.
Like I said, I try not to get too lost in philosophy.
And Maciej was the last one.
Hey, thanks for the talk. So I have a question about the particle colony. You said that the colony is aging, that it's getting older and older. Do you know why is that so? Is it like a result of some interventions of the municipality, or maybe some kind of result of demographic changes among the the people who live there?
No, I think it's a good thing, right? You get old cats, it means they've lived a good life and they're getting old. But also the lack of kittens, which there were no kittens in kitten season, and I think that's kind of sad. So there's no kittens being born, but there's always an influx of people just abandoning their pets there. So they see that, oh yeah, these cats have a great life and I can't keep my cats, so I'm just gonna dump them here. So that's how the colony maintains, so that they keep on control of the colony born cats through neutering, but new cats arrive. But yeah, I think it's just they're well fed, they live they get older, and if there's no kittens replacing them, but I think it keeps the population keeps stable by these newcomers that inevitably show up.
Why there are no kittens there? They don't reproduce? Because
all the new cats that arrive, they make sure that they're neutered, so they notice a new cat comes, they'll take the cat to the vet, and but yeah, I missed the kittens. There were a couple of kittens earlier in the year, but it's because somebody apparently dumped a pregnant cat, and she had the kittens, and the kittens were actually, they were adopted. I think she said that they were adopted, but they weren't. So yeah, and there was I think it was 10 or so years ago, or maybe a bit more, there was a real problem with overpopulation there, and talks from the authorities that they were going to come in and kill a bunch of the cats because there was too much. So arguably it's not a bad thing that they neuter them, but it's sad that there's no kittens anymore.
And we still have some time on the last question. So yeah, Philip.
So you mentioned the problem of cat cultures. I'm of course very happy about it, but I am also interested in human cultures in relation to cats. And it's probably a false assumption, but my assumption was that the idea of guardians for colony cats who are paid by government or who are volunteers, but like they are really marked as such. So this is of the northern origin, this idea of, and like if I before your talk, if I was thinking about cats in the Mediterranean area, it was that they are fed by locals, but I would say anarchically, without any established orders. So do you know if this you also showed on one of your pictures that there are the tags or like print that there are prints or tables printed that you shouldn't feed the cat. There is the authority looking. So this was. Do you think that this order is of the Spanish origin? That it came before the area was so heavily visited by English tourists, for example, or is it the result of like the international care about cats not being abandoned by? So maybe, I'm not sure if you understand me.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking so. These signs are relatively new. I think they're like 2-3 years old, and not everybody who feeds the cats is happy to them about them, and they ignore them, and they still feed the cats. But no, it is very much, yeah, it was fed, these cats for years, they've been fed by just, yeah, locals, visitors, and restaurants too. They'll feed the cat. So it is very organic. And I think part of this, yeah, so this now these signs, and that the council gave, yeah, there's 2 official feeders, but I met a whole bunch of unofficial feeders that just go out at different times of day. These cats totally scamming it. They're getting fed by multiple feeders, some who believe that they're the only people who feed the cats. But the authorities, they put these signs up a few years ago, and you now have to have a license and a name tag to legally feed the cats or officially feed the cats. But they still have to provide out of their own pocket. So you get the license, but you still have to buy the food to feed the cats. And I think part of that too is, so the concern the official feeders have is not that other people feed the cats. They don't mind that so much, providing they feed cat food and not coconut milk that gives them diarrhea. But also that they clean up. So yeah, these feeders, they also go around and pick up some of the empty packets. So that sort of creates a problem for the cats, because the council gets complaints of litter everywhere. So people leaving empty cat food cans lying about is bad for the cats, because it causes complaints. And then so yeah, not feeding them is more related to that. They don't want people littering and yeah, did I answer the question? Yeah, so I think that, yeah, it's sort of an after. But I think a lot of this came out in this area several years ago, when there really was that overpopulation and complaints, and now it's more sort of under control. But yeah, mostly people ignore the signs. Like, I saw people feeding cats in front of the "Do not feed the cat" sign, and I did see one argument escalated with, yeah, one of the feeders shouting at these women who were feeding the cats, and but yeah. So I don't know if I actually answered that question now, but yeah, it is very much like typical Mediterranean. The street cats and the restaurant owners are feeding them, and locals are feeding them. Everybody's feeding the cats.
Okay, time is up, so I'd like to thank you once again for your questions during the nice discussion, and once again I would like to thank Dr. Hill for her talk and her answers. Thank you.